Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Adijan Ayandar. It's been called one of the world's most dangerous flashpoints. Nuclear-armed neighbors India and Pakistan saw their decades-long dispute over Kashmir reach fever pitch last month. And it all started with a suicide bombing in India-administered Kashmir back on February the 14th, which was carried out by a local fighter. India blamed Pakistan-based militants for the attack and then retaliated by carrying out an airstrike across the border on what it said was a terrorist training camp. After a series of cat-and-mouse games, India saw one of its fighter planes shot down by Pakistan. Now, although the pilot was released just days later, a grenade attack hit the city of Jammu, killing at least 2 people. Hassan Abdullah tells us how this all unfolded.
India experienced one of the deadliest attacks in its history just 2 months before a general election. India says Pakistan-based Jaish-e-Mohammed was responsible for February's suicide bombing. It accuses Pakistan of supporting the group. Pakistan denies the charge, saying it had designated Jaish a terrorist organization many years ago. The situation escalated, and on the 26th of February, India said its jets hit a militant camp in Balakot, just across the border in Pakistan. Indian media claimed more than 300 militants were killed. Pakistan rejected those reports, saying India had merely targeted some trees. It released pictures to support its rebuttal. A day later, Pakistan said it had shot down 2 Indian fighter jets. The video of a captured Indian pilot soon emerged. In the following days, the 2 countries exchanged fire across the line of control separating India and Pakistan-administered Kashmir. Pakistan said it wanted to de-escalate.
हिंदुस्तान का पायलट हमने पकड़ा हुआ है. हम as a peace gesture हम उसको कल रिहा करने लगे हैं हिंदुस्तान के वास्ते.
But minutes after Prime Minister Imran Khan's announcement, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi addressed Indian scientists.
आप में एक पहले पायलट प्रोजेक्ट करने की परंपरा होती है और पायलट प्रोजेक्ट होने के बाद स्केलेबल किया जाता है. तो अभी एक पायलट प्रोजेक्ट हो गया. अभी रियल करना है. पहले तो प्रैक्टिस थी.
It was not received well by the neighbouring country. Here in Islamabad, people in the corridors of power have interpreted the Indian Prime Minister's statement as an implicit threat, and that seems to have dealt a big blow to the peace efforts. The international community is seeking de-escalation.
Kardeş Pakistan'ın hep yanında oldu. Ülkemizin hem Pakistan'la hem de Hindistan'la samimi, yapıcı, yoğun ve çok yönlü ilişkileri bulunuyor.
New Delhi insists that Islamabad must take firm action against militant groups. Islamabad says it's ready for counter-terrorism cooperation, but India must provide actionable intelligence. In a crackdown carried out since last month's suicide bombing, Pakistan's government says it's detained dozens of suspects, including some identified by India. Islamabad says recent anti-Pakistan posturing by Modi's government is aimed at winning support ahead of the elections. Much of the Indian opposition seems to support this view. Modi's government denies any wrongdoing and says its recent decisions were made for national security reasons. But doves on both sides of the border say New Delhi and Islamabad should set bigger goals, like scrapping the old ways and choosing a path that leads towards peace and economic prosperity. Hassan Abdullah, Straight Talk.
Well, joining me now is Victoria Schofield, who's the author of the book Kashmir and Conflict, and Farhan Mujahid Chak, who is an associate professor of political science over at Qatar University. Welcome to both of you. Good to have you on Straight Talk. Now, as we just saw in Hassan Abdullah's piece, this is a complicated jigsaw that is yet to find an answer. But the 2 sides have been fighting for control ever since the partition. Pakistan will tell you that most Kashmiris will want to join Pakistan because it's a Muslim-majority region. India says it's more closely integrated with India. This is an oversimplification, I understand. But Victoria, let me start off with you. How about the people of Kashmir on both sides of the line of control? What do they want? What are their desires?
Well, this is the difficulty because we've never had the promised plebiscite that was agreed would be held by the governments of India and Pakistan in 1947. And so there's never actually been a proper referendum or reference to the people, as was advocated at that time. But what you have here is a very complex issue because the state itself is complex. When we talk about Kashmir, we tend to do so in a shorthand version whereby we refer just to the Valley of Kashmir. But the actual state, the disputed state of Jammu and Kashmir, to give it its correct name, is a much larger entity covering vast land spaces both in the east and west, Ladakh, sparsely populated but mainly inhabited by Buddhists, the Gilgit-Baltistan area, inhabited by 100% Muslims. Then you have the smaller regions, Jammu, the Valley of Kashmir, and then this very narrow stretch of land, which in Pakistan is called Azad, i.e. free Jammu and Kashmir, but which the Indians call Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. And this is where the two forces stopped fighting in 1947. So when you say what do they want, you have to work out what each region would like. And this is where the complexities and the difficulty of resolution have so far not sort of been affected. But there hasn't been dialogue, and without the dialogue, you're not going to even get towards a resolution.
Farhan, Victoria, two words that actually stood out to me. One is shorthand version, the other is dialogue.
Right.
How do you get the people of Kashmir involved in this dialogue, and can they really voice their desires?
Absolutely, and it's a great question. I'd concur completely with how Victoria has characterized the conflict of the different regions, the 5 regions to be specific. But nonetheless, what has happened is that the Kashmiris themselves have been becoming increasingly more vocal lately. So you have them throughout universities in North America. I'm myself born and raised in Canada, and there are other Kashmiris that are teaching at the University of Toronto, University of Missouri, and in Lafayette College. There are these Kashmiris that have come forward that are now opening new space, and they're demanding to be a part of the discussion. And to be frank, Pakistan has accepted this. The real challenge is convincing the Indian government to come to the drawing board. Let's sit down, let's talk. This is not a bilateral issue. This is not between India and Pakistan. As a matter of fact, it's even bigger than India, Pakistan, and Kashmiris. It is an international crisis that could go into a nuclear fallout, that the world should be concerned about what is going on in Kashmir. This is not something to be played with for politicking or internal election time. More than 1 billion people's lives can be affected here.
Okay, so you've talked about how this is potentially could even grow as an international crisis.
Absolutely.
But what we've seen is the outbreak of fighting between India and Pakistan has reminded the world, once again, that despite all these resolutions passing at the United Nations,
right,
despite mediators being assigned, despite being all this debating, the United Nations is no closer to finding a solution.
That's right.
Can new actors, whether it's Turkey, whether it's the OIC, come in here and actually bring a breath of fresh air?
Well, I mean, one of the difficulties is that the government of India, specifically since the 1972 Shimla Agreement, has focused on the fact that this is only a bilateral issue and has not wanted to have a third-party mediator, facilitator, interlocutor at all. And once one or other country doesn't accept having a mediator, it's very difficult to impose a mediator, whether it be the United Nations or a representative of the United Nations or indeed a, so to speak, neutral country. And that's why there is such a stalemate, because whenever Pakistan and India do come to the talk about a peace process, and we have had peace process, we've had discussions, I agree totally, they're not discussing at the moment. But it comes a stalemate because there isn't a third party in a way as a scapegoat who could be blamed for any compromise that need to be made.
If there is no third party allowed in these talks, what's the likely outcome? Should the international community then push for both sides to sort of recognize the line of control as sort of the final border then?
Well, Ali, I would say rather than push that, that's not going to happen, and the Kashmiris won't accept it. They should push the parties to the table. The international community has to bring all the parties to the table. This is our purpose for traveling around the world, to writing. My book on Islam and Pakistan's political culture had a chapter on Kashmir. Victoria has written extensively on Kashmir over 20 illustrious years. So all of us, both Kashmiris and non-Kashmiris, are going to change this narrative and push people for purposes of peace. Come to the table, and this is what I hope all fair-minded people allow that plebiscite to happen. Allow people to choose their destiny. Are Kashmiris not entitled to have that right that everyone else in the world declares as a right to choose their leaders, to choose their future? So that's not something that we're going to give up.
Okay. Now, the reality is that India and Pakistan will have to be involved in a major role in whatever formula we move forward.
Absolutely.
They're occupying different regions.
True.
India occupies roughly 2/3, Pakistan occupies roughly 1/3.
And we saw the two countries react somewhat differently in this latest attack in Pulwama. We saw the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, sort of beat the drums of patriotism, and obviously we know the reasons behind that. He's got an election, he's seeking re-election in several weeks now. Will the Kashmir issue always be an important card in domestic politics for these two countries?
Well, I think that's one of the great tragedies, is that the Kashmiris are themselves hostage to this, what I would call, failed relationship between India and Pakistan. If you look at how the issue has been almost cyclical, it rises up, it's used, the card's played, it's then withdrawn, it's put back on the table again. And I think really one of the greatest tragedies is the numbers of deaths, not to mention the human rights abuses that have caused through intense militarization, because the conflict hasn't been resolved.
So you talked about, Victoria, you talked about this, every time there's an escalation, you try to go into a mode of de-escalation. But is that going to be sort of to maintain the status quo? Is that going to be sort of like a cyclical,
unfortunately,
or do you actually have to really tackle the issue?
You really do have to tackle the issue. And one of the things that I say constantly, and I apologize for repeating myself, but we've just had this latest terrorist attack. We had Mumbai in 2008. We had the bombing of the Delhi Parliament in 2001. And then at that point, it's this escalation. You fear armies massing. This may be war, maybe a nuclear conflagration. Then you have de-escalation. But who knows, next time, you might not have de-escalation. Right. And this is the danger, not to mention the huge amounts of money that both governments spend on their armed forces, which they could well do with spending on poverty, eradication, health, education of their peoples. The suffering of those people in the land which is being fought over.
You know, just to jump in there, Ali, I totally agree, but I'd like to add in one thing here. I think that it's a strategy that India has always used to deflect to realizing the aspirations of the Kashmiri people, or even admitting there is a problem, by saying that it's a bilateral issue and it's really between us and Pakistan, and then to intentionally escalate matters with Pakistan, when to point out this was a Kashmiri attack that happened inside Kashmir. Now, however we want to characterize it, Kashmiris are rebelling against this grotesque militarization of their space and their homes. More than 700,000 approximate soldiers and paramilitary forces are within the Indian occupied territories. And the violation of human, 11,000 documented cases of rape. You know, 150,000 people have been imprisoned. Right now, there are the longest serving prisoners right now, Dr. Ashik and Asya Andrabi. There's thousands in Indian prisons. This is the atmosphere that young Kashmiri boys and girls are growing up in. They are resisting the Indian state. They're fearless. This is a young, fearless, aggressive generation that is demanding its rights.
So you mentioned new generations, perhaps new problems, but also perhaps new solutions on the horizon. Farhan, Victoria, thank you very much for coming on to Straight Talk.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
What was once a close bond stretching back centuries is now at one of the lowest points in recent memory. Turkey and Egypt, two countries who have shared histories, now find themselves at odds on a range of issues. One has been Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's outspoken criticism of Egyptian leader Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Recently, President Erdogan said he wouldn't speak with a leader like Sisi. That's after the execution of 9 men sentenced for the killing of a prosecutor back in 2015. But there are many other sticking points, from the mass detentions of Egyptian dissidents to energy disputes in the Mediterranean Sea. Our Abu Bakr al-Shamahi has more.
Egyptians and Turks are close culturally, and their countries have long historical ties. But when it comes to politics, the country's leaders are miles apart.
Tayyip Erdoğan niçin Sisi ile görüşmüyor diyenlere cevap veriyorum. Aracı olanlar oluyor, geliyor zaman zaman. Ben böyle bir kişiyle asla görüşmem.
Those comments came after Egypt executed 9 men found guilty of killing the Egyptian Prosecutor General in 2015. In court, the men said that they only confessed to the murder because they were tortured, but that wasn't enough to save them. On the Egyptian side, the foreign ministry hit back at Turkey. saying that Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan once again speaks to us about Egypt and its political leadership, clearly showing hatred. Erdogan's reaction to the executions in Egypt was different to the European Union's. On February the 24th, only days after the executions, EU leaders were guests of Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi at the first summit of the European Union and the Arab League. And while some EU leaders made cursory statements about human rights, Sisi used his podium to defend the executions. The feeling among Egypt's critics and in Ankara is that the EU has been hypocritical in emphasizing human rights and then sharing the red carpet with Sisi. Turkey's position goes all the way back to 2013. Before Egypt's coup in July of that year, Erdogan had been a close ally of Egypt's first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi. And he stayed loyal to him, even as Morsi has spent the past 5 years in prison. Now, Egypt and Turkey don't share ambassadors, and thousands of Egyptian exiles have fled to Turkey. 5 years on from Sisi taking power in Egypt, there are very few signs of a reconciliation between Cairo and Ankara. Egypt is allied with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, countries that have shown themselves to be unfriendly to Turkey in recent years. And Turkey, on the other hand, has allied with Qatar, the country being blockaded by Cairo, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. And there's another spanner in the works. Last September, Egypt signed a deal with Cyprus that may eventually lead to a gas pipeline between the two countries. But there's one side that's been left out of the conversation over the deal: the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. Turkey is the only state that recognises Northern Cyprus, and Ankara says that they need to be included in any deal. And so, the potential is for even more complications in this already broken relationship, and no signs that Egypt and Turkey are getting back together anytime soon. Abu Bakr al-Shamahi, Straight Talk.
And joining me now in the studio is Mustafa Aydin, who's a professor of international relations at Kadir Has University, and Mohammed Al-Masri, who's an associate professor in the journalism and media and cultural studies programs at the Doha Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you to Straight Talk. Good to have you on set. Now, with the 9 men accused of killing the country's top prosecutor, Hisham Barakat, the total number of those executed in the country related to this case is now up to 15. Mohammed, let me start off with you. Many people in the country, as well as outside of Egypt, have called this case a monument to unfair trials in Egypt. Is that a fair assessment?
I think so. I mean, if there was ever a kangaroo justice system, it's what we're witnessing in Egypt, right? These 9 men were forced to confess to this crime under torture. Torture is widespread. It's systematic in Egyptian prisons. This has been uncovered by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Human Rights Monitor, and other human rights groups. There's no debate about it in any human rights circle. And this, moreover, isn't the first time we've seen people wrongly executed in Egypt. There have been several of these problematic executions after mass trials and mass death sentences. There was the famous Arab Sharkas case from a couple of years ago when 6 young men were executed for a crime that they could not have possibly committed because they were already in jail at the time the alleged crime was carried out. Okay,
Mustafa, I want to bring it in the conversation. Let's take a step back and take a look at it from Turkey's perspective. Yeah. Should Turkey have a legitimate concern here, or is this just sort of an expected knee-jerk reaction from a country that's not getting along with Egypt?
Well, it's a concern here. It's not only knee-jerk, of course. Turkey is a country in this region, is a very turbulent region, and wants to develop its relationship with Egypt, including Egypt, in the countries in the region. And Egypt is developing its relationship in certain ways in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean that's trying to kind of circle Turkey with different alliance systems. So Turkey has this legitimate concern that Egypt is moving in the wrong direction. And also Turkey is, as a country who's trying to exist as a democracy in this very difficult part of the world, seeing another country moving in the wrong direction, it's not a concerting idea.
Mohammed Al-Masri, how do you see the future relations?
I think it's going to continue to be rocky. You know, right now, Sisi's pushing through constitutional amendments that'll keep him in power until at least 2034. So there doesn't seem to be any sort of scaling back on the authoritarianism and the repression that we see in Egypt. And for the reasons the professor just mentioned and others, I think that we can expect that there'll be continued sort of rocky relations between Turkey and Egypt. I mean, there have been trade relations ongoing, but from a diplomatic standpoint, I think we're going to continue to see problems.
Just about 10 days ago, the first European Union Arab League summit was held in Cairo, and the European Union came under a lot of heavy criticism because of its deafening silence of the executions in Egypt, sort of accepting a red carpet invitation from the leader of a country where mass human rights violations are going on and where the death penalty had just been enforced. Mohammed, let me start with you. The fact that President Trump has chosen sort of not to promote human rights and democracy as part of his foreign policy, do you think this sort of emboldens the Egyptian leader?
I don't think there's any question. I mean, I've written about this. Trump has signaled that he effectively doesn't care about human rights. That's not his priority. And so that has given confidence to leaders like Sisi to carry out their repressive agendas. Now, in terms of this summit that took place the week before last in Sharm el-Sheikh, I think this was a deeply misguided move by these European leaders that took part. And mostly, what you mentioned, the criticism, the reason why they're being criticized is because this served as an effective endorsement for Sisi and really for the executions, even though some of the leaders did pay lip service to human rights.
Do you think there's a double standard when you look at sort of how the European Union approaches various partners in the region? It's criticized Turkey a lot in terms of, is there a double standard here?
There is a double standard, but there is also a logic. If you look from the European perspective, they say, okay, Turkey is a partner country, so we criticize Turkey much more than any other country because Turkey wants to be part of the European Union. But we are not criticizing Egypt. We are trying to get connection to Egypt in order to change their attitude. Okay, this is a kind of an explanation, and it makes a logic. But again, European Union made its influence in international politics, especially since the end of the Cold War, with its values and ethics and ethical approach in politics. So if they are just forsaking this approach, then it's very difficult to see what's difference that EU can make.
Okay, another area of conflict between Turkey and Egypt is the issue of energy exploration in the Eastern Mediterranean. Turkey has said that for anything to go ahead, the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus needs to be on board. This having a lot of difficulty convincing Egypt. Mustafa, let me start with you. The fact that the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus is only recognized by Turkey, does it sort of make things difficult for that side?
It does, but it's not only that. I mean, first of all, Turkey is the biggest, the country has the biggest shoreline in the Eastern Mediterranean, and it's not included in the discussion of this ISMET Energy Forum. That's first. The second is the Turkish Cypriots are part and parcel of the Republic of Cyprus, which is recognized entity. It doesn't matter that there is a Republic of Northern Cyprus, Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, but they have been in negotiations for years with their Greek partners to solve the issue. And until that issue is solved, they are still part of that state that was established in 1960. So that gives them rights, number of rights, including economic rights over any kind of energy finds in the Eastern Mediterranean to the Turkish Cypriots.
Mohammed, both Turkey and Egypt are two countries that are in search of energy sources. How important is this project for Egypt, the potential gas line between Cyprus and Egypt?
I think it's important. As I mentioned a couple minutes ago, Sisi's mismanaged the economy. He invested billions of dollars into the Suez Canal project without doing a feasibility study. He promised that there would be billions more every year in annual revenue. That has not come to fruition. He's also spent $45 billion on a new capital city that will only serve Egypt's elites. There'll be a massive, tower, the tallest tower in Africa. There'll be a mega mall. There'll be a park. But meanwhile, 30% of Egyptians live on about $50 a month. So he's really sort of leaving out the common man. So this project is important, as are many other projects. I think the economy is really at the heart of Sisi's problems, and it's one of the things that's leading to a greater sense of instability in the country. You mentioned stability a moment ago about the summit, and I don't want to take us too far back, but I just want to note that Egypt is more unstable now than it has been at any time in its modern history, and that's significant because Sisi came to power on a security and stability platform. By his own admission, there have been thousands of terrorist attacks, so he's been unable to contain that problem.
All right, Mustafa Aydin, Mohamed Al-Masri, good to have you on Straight Talk. Thank you for your analysis.
Thanks.
Well, that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Adijan Ayandar. If you've got any comments, please do share them with us on Twitter, the hashtag Straight Talk. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.